Pendulum syndrome. Just before we start, I want to mention two upcoming things that we're doing. We're doing another Kabbalah, short Kabbalah series on Monday night. That's Monday night, 25th of June and 2nd of July. It's called the Kabbalah of the Jewish months, understanding the mystical ideas behind the names of the months and the whole setup of the Jewish months. We'll focus on two particular months this particular series. Also next Monday night, not this Monday night, but sorry, this Friday, not this Friday night, but next Friday night, 29th, we're doing another mindful BINA. That's at 6 p.m. over here. Okay, so just a little bit of review from last week. Last week we talked about the concept that society works on a pendulum sort of mindset often. We gave different examples last week, like education. Society ran an education system full of control and harshness, and then swung to the other extreme of permissiveness. Talked about people on extreme right, extreme left, no one can tolerate the other, and so on and so forth. And the second thing is we talked about people operating in boxes, in fragments, and can only sort of handle their particular mindset, and then when that doesn't work, they go to an extreme other mindset, but never combine the two. So we explained that balance is a hard thing to achieve because, number one, the divine design of the world is that God created the world in compartments and a world of definitions. That's what the world is. The finiteness of the world is the world of different definitions. And secondly, part of that design is that the creative force, the creative force behind the different fragments, as we explained last week, that God transcends the definition and can combine both, but the force which is behind the various compartments of the various definitions, by divine design, is concealed from the world, and therefore each compartment is seen as kind of a separate entity, a separate reality, a separate definition, and therefore very hard to tolerate and accept the other, and it becomes an issue of a little bit of ego. In other words, there's the egocentricity that exists in each mindset. It doesn't have to be a bad ego necessarily, but it's even a subtle ego which exists within each mindset and makes it difficult to move beyond and to incorporate the other. So, therefore, we explained last week that the mindset to try and explore, to try and absorb and to develop, which is often not the default disposition of most human beings, is the concept of tiferet, which is that middle line that we talked about. So the world predominantly is in the right and the left, the chesed and the gvura, and the tiferet is the really, really hard one, and that's the one to try and absorb. And as we explained last week, that tiferet has various translations. So it translates sometimes as balance, truth, harmony, beauty, empathy, and as we explained, it's all really related because achieving balance is hard because it means moving away from the way we look at things, moving away from our mindset, from our paradigm, and tapping into or understanding and appreciating what is needed. In other words, not the way I look at it, but what does the situation need? What does this relationship need? What does the experience need? In other words, looking for the truth. That's why and normally that requires a balance. It requires a combination of various mindsets. And that's why it means balance, and that's why it means truth, because a tiferet is always looking for the truth. Empathy is so often connected with that because empathy means I don't look at a person or a situation the way I look at it the way they understand it. I try to empathize, I try to understand where the other is coming from. Beauty, because we explained that beauty is the combination of colors. As the Kabbalah says that when you have a garment of colors, it creates a certain in-depth beauty which is more beautiful than just a singular sort of thing. And that's why all these translations of the word tiferet are all very, very much connected. Now, as we said, that's why tiferet becomes hard, because a tiferet, at the end of the day, means that we need to move away from ourselves, because the ourselves that we talk about is normally boxed in to one or two boxes, right? We have a specific definition, we have a specific paradigm. Tiferet always means the ability to achieve balance, but that will only happen if we move away from who we are. We move away from ourselves. And that's a difficult thing to do. Most human beings find that hard. That's a lifelong work. That's part of the fundamental part of what we are, and what our work is all about, is to recognize when something is coming from the egocentric point of view, and something is coming from our own bias or our own agenda, even if it's good, even if it's subtle. We're not talking about negative arrogance here, we're just talking about even subtle ego, but ego nonetheless, and that's very hard to get beyond that. Sometimes we need others to help us, we need a mentor, we need to really think about it, and so on and so on. That's interesting that Maimonides, the Rambam, in a very, very important and significant section of his magnum opus called the Mishnah Torah, in the works nowadays, he has a section called Hilchot Dayot, which is the laws of human behavior, essentially, right? Where he discusses at great length the various characteristics of various human beings, talks about the correct path. A little bit it's based on Pirkei Avot, the ethics of the fathers, which also does that. And the Rambam has a very, very famous piece where he talks about the middle road, right? Balanced lifestyle. Now, we'll talk soon about, there's different translations of the word balance, but for this discussion he talks about the concept of balance, which is, he says, everyone has different characteristics. So for example, he says, there are people who are very good at saving money, so they're very, very careful before they spend. There are people who are not careful at all, they just spend, right? There are people who want a lot of things, there are people who don't want anything. Right? And he goes on to explain where there's a place for all these characteristics, they're not good or bad, there's a place for all of them. And the real test is, he says, to achieve balance, to achieve the derech ha'emtza'i, he calls it, the middle way. In other words, it's not good to indulge, but it's not good to never do anything. It's not good to overspend, to waste money, but it's also not good to always be tight, right? There's a place for everything. And he goes into many, many sort of character traits where he talks about that, and he says that a person should always strive for that balanced life, sort of the middle road, as he calls it. With two exceptions. The two exceptions that Maimonides talks about is arrogance and anger. Right? Arrogance and anger. Rage, in other words. Why is that? He says there, you have to eradicate it completely. There's no middle road. There's not like a bit of rage is good, or a bit of arrogance is good. Now, not to confuse arrogance with confidence, they're two different things. And in fact, sometimes good confidence or feeling secure within oneself actually comes from humility and not arrogance, as we've talked about in other times. But arrogance, in terms of feelings of ego, he says are completely bad. One should move away completely, and so should one with rage. Why? Because, he doesn't explain this, but I think the concept behind it is this. That what stands in the way of a balanced lifestyle is arrogance and rage. Why rage? Because rage is the first cousin of arrogance. People losing temper is a form of arrogance. I think we've talked about this other times, but losing a temper is because we feel so wrapped up in ourselves and we're so into things happening to us that we didn't expect, and how we need to control things and so on and so forth. Losing one's temper is very much a manifestation of self, right? And therefore it's related to arrogance. And arrogance is that one thing that stands in the way of a balanced lifestyle. Arrogance stands in the way of tiferet. Because as we said before, tiferet means moving beyond myself. Tiferet means being able to leave my paradigm, being able to leave the way I look at it, being able to leave the way I emotionally, instinctively respond to it, and look at the truth. Look at what's needed. Look at what's moral. Look at what's right. Look at what's true. Right? So therefore, to achieve tiferet, to achieve a balanced lifestyle, requires me to not be arrogant. Requires me to always check in that I'm not being driven by any form of ego, even subtle ego. And that's why the Rambam says ego is the driver of negativity, and therefore there's no balance in ego. Ego is ego. Right? It's not like half ego. It doesn't work like that. Half ego is ego. So with all other character traits, they have a place. God created them, they have a place, they can be used for good or for bad. Normally any extreme is bad, moderation, balance is good, and therefore we combine different character traits, and that's a good, healthy and emotionally stable lifestyle. But he says with arrogance there's no balance, because arrogance just stands in the way. Ego stands in the way from achieving that balanced lifestyle, and therefore ego has to go as much as we can, as much as we can work on it, which is obviously a difficult thing to do, but that's what life is about, trying to work on that. Now, just to continue a little bit and explore the importance of Tiferet and what that means, I want to just clarify something, because it will be relevant to the discussion we're going to have. When we talk about balanced lifestyle, right, people often misunderstand it. Balanced lifestyle doesn't only mean, it could mean, but doesn't only mean compromise. In other words, it doesn't mean a little bit of this, a little bit of that, right? But true Tiferet could actually mean a greater depth of combination. Tiferet means combining both sides, combining the chesed and gvura. Tiferet means the ability to respond by using different types of emotions, those that gel with me and those that don't, those that are my personality, those that aren't. But it doesn't always mean, like the Rambam does talk about there, it means sort of a bit of both, but it doesn't always mean that. Because sometimes, right, sometimes certain experiences, certain situations require or call for extreme emotion or a big dose of emotion. But they might call for a big dose or an extreme of opposite emotions. And that's very, very difficult to combine the both. Because to respond to a situation using, and we'll give you examples of this in a second, but to respond to a situation where you've got strong opposite emotions is very difficult. There you really have to be able to focus on what's needed and not what you want to do. Because normally when we get caught up in an extreme of emotion, it's all about us. It's normally extreme emotions are an expression of self. They're an expression of, I just can't stand this anymore, so I'm going to get really upset about it. Or I'm going to really tolerate it, or I'm really going to not tolerate it. I'm going to be very tolerant or intolerant. And that's how it normally works. But to be able to actually have a combination of opposite emotions, but not just by compromising both, having a little bit of each, but actually having a strong dose of each, that's very, very difficult. Now we find that with that concept, first of all, comes from God. Right? It's a concept mentioned in the Zohar where when God took the Jewish people out of Egypt, so we've talked about this in previous times about the midnight principle, where God took them out of Egypt in midnight and gave them freedom, and freedom means the ability to combine both chesed and gvura, and that was the idea of the midnight, because the first half of the night is gvura, second half of the night is chesed, and the midnight transcends both, right? But the Zohar says that at the defining moment of the exodus of Egypt, God took the Jewish people out of Egypt, he himself responded in one moment with two very extreme emotions, extreme things. What was that? That when it came the moment of midnight, when the Jews left Egypt, at that moment it was the same moment where God killed the firstborns of the Egyptians. Right? Now, not going into the discussion why God needed to do that, but he did, obviously, because he did it. Right? And God decided that it was the right thing to do, whether it was punishment, whether it was eradicating impurity, whether it was dismantling the impure infrastructure of what Egypt symbolized. That's a whole separate discussion. But God decided that what was required to give room for the exodus from Egypt for the Jewish people and to give them the gift of freedom was extreme harshness, the ultimate harshness for the Egyptian people, where at the very, very same time, he gave the ultimate gift of kindness to Bnei Israel, to the Jewish people, which was the exodus of Egypt. The moment of freedom, the gift of freedom, was given at midnight. And the Zohar says that at that moment of midnight, there were two opposite things happening at the same time. He calls it Naguf leMitzrayim v'Raful Yisrael. In other words, it was extreme gevura, extreme harshness on one hand, and extreme kindness on the other hand, happening at the same time from the one God. It wasn't balance in the sense where there was a bit of both. It wasn't a bit of both. It was extreme both. And yet they were able to come together. Because for God that's not difficult, because God is above definitions, as we explained last week. That's the whole concept. He's not locked into any paradigm, he's not locked into any definition. He does what is needed to be done, and therefore there can be the combination of the extremes. But what we need to understand is that spark of divinity that we have gives us the ability to do the same when needed, and to be able to do the same. But it only comes through reflecting, and it's not always so clear-cut, and it needs a lot of work, and it needs understanding, and it needs to understand what is the correct thing to do, what is the truth, and that truth gives us the ability to view beyond ourselves and to bring together two opposites. So, That's an important thing to understand, what Tiferet actually means. And why that is so important, and why balance is so important, is this. What we find is an interesting thing, and I'm going to give you a few examples. When we have a goal, for example, when people have certain values, right? But they only express one particular value in its extreme. See, in the real sense of morality, the real truth of morality, the way Jewish thinking lays out morality, there are conflicting values, like the chesed and gvura. And to live a real value-based life requires often opposites. Because what we find is, and this is where it's interesting, when one has a particular value, right? Very, very strong value. Unless you can learn to incorporate an opposite to that value, not only won't you be living a balanced life, but you will end up undermining that very value. Right? So let me give you a godly example first, then I'm going to give you some practical examples of where it plays out in our own human experience. When God created the world, right, He said, it says in the Tehillim, it says in the verses, that God based the creation of the world on one particular value, is called chesed, kindness. That was the goal of creation. Right? And olam chesed ibaneh, the world is based on kindness. God wanted to do kindness to people. He wanted there to be a world, and He wanted to be able to give to that world. In order to do kindness, one of the things He had to do was express an emotion which is the opposite of kindness, which is gvura. Why? Because the Kabbalah mentions the problem that God is infinite, and therefore in God's infinite expression there is no room for another existence, there is no room for a finite world, and therefore God engaged, this is a Kabbalistic idea, in a concept called tzimtzum. Tzimtzum means He hid His infinite expression. He held back. And holding back is not a kindness. Holding back is not an expression of kindness. Holding back is what we call a holding back. It's gevura, right? God did that because He wanted to give. In other words, had He just gone with, if His value was kindness, and therefore He would have just gone with extreme kindness, He would never be able to do the kindness. Because in order to achieve that kindness, He would have to first hold back a little bit so He could create and make room for a finite world, for a limited world, and then be able to be kind. Does that make sense? Yeah. A very practical example of that is parenting. The goal of parents to their children, obviously they love their children. That's all. No one wants to be harsh with their children. No one wants to hold back from their children. Right? Parents, especially the relation between parents and children, parents want to give their children everything. But the only way to give children everything is to sometimes hold back. Because parents who want to give their children everything and end up giving them everything, end up spoiling them and not giving them anything. You know what I'm saying, right? End up damaging them, and they haven't given them. So a very simple example of what we're talking about is, in a parenting type of scenario where you need both chesed and gvura. The goal is only chesed. The goal is just to love them. The goal is to give them life. The goal is to give them everything they need for their future life. It's only about giving. But that giving requires sometimes harshness, and sometimes extreme harshness. It requires creating boundaries. Something that today's society is a little bit challenged with. But it requires an opposite of chesed and gvura. It requires a big dose of both. It requires a big dose of love, and it requires a big dose of structure and discipline. Otherwise you don't achieve what your goal is, and your goal is chesed. Right? So let me explore this a little bit and give you a couple of examples which then will try and make it relevant to our own human experience. So there's a very interesting story a couple of weeks ago which sort of went a bit viral. There's a story with a guy who was traveling to Israel. His name is Gab Kaufman. And he was in Ben Gurion Airport. And at Ben Gurion Airport there was a booth, a tefillin booth. Those who've been to the hotel might know what a tefillin booth is. Tefillin booth means there was a Chabad guy standing there who people put on tefillin with other people, and he was offering people to put on tefillin. And Gab Kaufman was traveling and thought it was a good idea. He's not a person that puts on tefillin every day, that's fine. And he said yes, I guess he had some time to his flight. He said, why not? Good idea, do a mitzvah, put on tefillin. It happened to be the booth was in a lounge, in one of the gates, and it happened to be a couple of seats before, there was a woman sitting there who was very, very upset. Now, that's fine, people will be upset, that's okay. But she did something about it. And the guy took a video of it and it went viral, and it wasn't very nice for her. But she went ballistic, she went crazy. Why are you doing this? Go somewhere else, you're bothering me, you're doing this, went right? Okay. What was very, very fascinating, and that was, that can happen. People voice their views, and I'm not sure why it was so. I mean, she could have moved the seat. I don't know why it bothered her so much. But what turned out was very, very fascinating, and it highlighted a very, very big problem in today's society. Right? Now, there's different views. Some people like the idea of someone standing there putting on tefillin. Other people sometimes don't like it. That's all good. But I'm not sure why she bothered that much to have to scream and shout, but that's what she did. Okay. But it turned out, and it says you're forcing religion, and she went crazy. I mean, it's a video. It's not like it. It turned out, who is this person? It turned out like this: that she's an academic. Right now, she's quite high up in the University of Maryland. But she's an expert, I'm reading to you, in multicultural theories, and is known to have published books such as Education in Multicultural Society, Pluralism, and Congruence Amongst Cultural Divisions. So how on earth is someone who's dedicated part of their life at least to diversity, to pluralism, to acceptance of everyone, gets so upset about a guy putting on tefillin with someone else in the Ben Gurion airport, right? But the truth is, it happens all the time. Why does it happen all the time? Because of lack of tiferet, lack of balance, lack of being able to incorporate opposites. What does that mean? You see, there are people, these kind of things, acceptance of others, multicultural on some level, tolerance, diversity, they all can be very, very good values. And they, in their own right, they're very, very good things, right? But what happens often is like this, that if it's left unchanneled, number one. And number two, if it just becomes my thing, becomes my ism or my passion, right? Without a perspective of truth, without a perspective of objectivity, it becomes so extreme that you land up with being completely intolerant. Because you become intolerant of anything that seems not to share that passion of yours. Follow what I'm saying? Now, we probably what happened was she saw this as her thing was diversity and accepting everyone for who they are, and that's all good, right? And therefore, for her, someone else having the notion of that guy doesn't put on tefillin, let me offer him to put on tefillin, was somehow didn't fit into her, or she perceived the person doing it as someone not as tolerant as her or as accepting as her, and they went crazy. But in going crazy, undermined her whole view, her whole life view. Because the inability to combine different things. Right? Now it happens a lot today, right? It happens a lot against the whole fight against racism. Now racism is a terrible thing. Terrible thing. But you have extreme people who fight racism to the point where anyone who doesn't exactly approach their fight in the way that they think it needs to be approached gets excluded, gets labeled as being racist, being this, being that, right? In other words, it becomes a situation of reverse racism. So in the fight, in the pursuit of racism, often what people do is they become racist to the people who don't share exactly their way of pursuing racism. Now, there might be different ways to pursue racism. There might be people who don't exactly understand it the way they do, and so on and so forth. We'll develop this in a second. It's a very, very important thing. But it's about that pendulum because it comes from a pendulum syndrome. Because what happened was, there was a time in America or in other places in Western societies where people were intolerant, where there was racism, where there was bigotry. And the world, thank God, has swung away from that. And it started to embrace tolerance, and it started to embrace inclusion, which is a good thing. The problem is it goes to such a crazy extreme that therefore it's got to be done a particular way, and it's got to be done my way. And if it's not done my way, that means if you don't exactly agree, or you don't accept and tolerate and embrace and engage exactly the way I say you need to do it, that means you're a racist, and I'm going to exclude you and fight you, and be incredibly disrespectful to you and exercise reverse racism. So when you go in the extreme, you end up undermining your very, very value, right? Which is a crazy thing. Which really goes into a whole nother topic, right? It goes into the whole topic about respectful disagreement. You know, I think I've said this before, one of the things that always really, really bothers me is the dialogue that happens in Parliament. It bothers me because today, not that I really care what happens in Parliament, because I don't know if anyone knows what they're doing there, so it doesn't make a difference, or they do know, I don't know, I don't know, I certainly don't know, have a great understanding of these things, so whatever they do is fine. But what bothers me is that today everything's out in the open. And what bothers me is that kids watch this and they grow up and they actually observe a culture of such disrespect, of such humiliation, of such negativity, that I can't imagine that it wouldn't have an effect on it, an effect on society in general, right? This is leadership. This is the core of our leadership, right? What bothers me about it is this. What bothers me about it is the inability, I think this goes back to the whole acceptance and tolerance and things like that, right? You see, balance can mean the opposite extremes. What I mean by that is as follows. For me to be respectful to you, for me to accept you, for me not to be judgmental to you, doesn't mean I have to agree with you. And that's, I think, what society finds so hard to get their head around. I can vehemently disagree with you, but I can embrace you at the same time. Because acceptance and being non-judgmental doesn't come with agreeing. On the contrary. See, I think in the world today there's this notion that acceptance and tolerance means you agree with the person, means you embrace their philosophy, means you embrace their ideals and their values. It doesn't. Everyone's entitled to their set of values, and values are things which are very strong, and people should live a value-based life, and people are entitled to have very, very strong values. I'm not talking about extremism and all that, that's something else. I'm talking about just in normal society, right? In normal society, people it's okay to have very, very strong values, and to protect those values and defend those values and believe in those values, and to vehemently disagree with someone who doesn't hold those values, and still be respectful of them, and still accept them, and still embrace them, and still not judge them. I don't judge people who don't have my values. That doesn't mean I can't have those values, right? And that's what goes on. People either have to agree, or if that's where the pendulum is. Either people have to agree, or if they don't agree, it's got to be disrespectful. Why? Right? That's where the lack of tiferet is there. That's because people can't get their head around doing two things at the same time. Now, in the Talmud, for example, we find that there was the famous two schools of thought between Bet Shammai and Bet Hillel, and they were arch enemies on an academic level. They were arch enemies on a halachic level. They argued all the time. And yet they had tremendous respect for each other. And the stories in Talmud to demonstrate that. They were able to do both things at the same time. The Rambam, the famous Rambam, who I quoted before, Maimonides. If you look at a book of Maimonides, the way it's printed, there's footnotes on the side, written by another colleague of his, a contemporary of his, called the Ravad, Rabbi Avram ben David, I think his name was. Right? Now, if you didn't understand how these things work, and you looked in the Rambam, and you read the notes of the Ravad, you would think these two were real enemies, coming from the perspective of the way people look at it today. Why? The Ravad had a whole problem with the Rambam. He didn't think the way the Rambam wrote his book was correct. There was a whole ideological argument on how to explain the laws of the Torah. The Rambam says it was okay just to write a book without giving reasons, just so it should be simple and accessible for people to read. The Ravad said that's very inappropriate, you have to give the reasoning because people should be able to deduce and interpret. A very, very long and involved argument, and therefore he felt that when the Rambam wrote his very, very famous Magnum Opus, he wrote that he felt that the Rambam made mistakes. So he went through the Rambam with a fine-tooth comb, and wherever he thought the Rambam made a mistake, he made a very big point of writing a footnote and saying this is wrong. Right? And he wrote a commentary like that, and it's printed in the Rambam as a footnote. Right? In fact, when we learned in Yeshiva, the kind of, not joke, but the sort of the cute thing was that we used to say that when you learn a piece of the Rambam and there's no footnote of the Ravad, you know it's such a strongly tested theory because not only the Rambam holds like that, but the Ravad does too, otherwise he would have argued, right? Otherwise, it was rechecked by him, so that was a really tested theory, and therefore, you know, okay. So when you look at the Ravid, he's sharp. He says this is not true, this is mistaken. He defends his view, this is nonsense. Sometimes he says, right, this is not the way you should do it, it's not, you've learned the wrong, you've interpreted the Talmud wrong, and so on and so forth. Which is all good, that's the way halachic learning works. There's different areas of interpretation, and there's room for both interpretations, and so on. Okay. But if you just learn it, and you're not quite involved in that kind of school of learning, you think they were real enemies. And yet if you look in the historic books that talk about these two great men, they were the greatest of friends. And they were able to be greatest of friends. Because one thing they do now, were able to strongly disagree and respectfully disagree, without being personal, without putting down the other person, without humiliating the person, without excluding the other person. They were able to do that. Why? Because they both didn't have an ego. They were both out for the truth. They were both out. And they came to different conclusions within context. That's fine. Right? The notion that you either have to agree with someone or disrespect them is a lack of tiferet. It's a lack of balance. It's just people find it very hard to get their head around it. The ability to say to someone, look, I actually have to strongly disagree with you, but I truly, truly don't judge you, accept you, embrace you, include you. We'll sit down at a Shabbos table together with you. We'll go out with you. It's fine. And we can remain strongly opposed. People find that very hard because that is an expression of tiferet. It can be both extremes. I can truly love and accept someone with truth in an extreme way and be their true friend, and yet I can have an extreme disagreement with them. It's all the same thing. And that's, by the way, the true meaning of tolerance, I think. When you're tolerant of someone and you feel that tolerance means you have to agree with someone, that's a limited tolerance, because that means someone you don't agree with, you can't be tolerant of. Which is what we see today in the fight, sometimes in the name of tolerance, in the name of acceptance, when people fight racism and all these things, and yet they're so intolerant, people disagree with them, it becomes reverse racism because it's a very limited degree of tolerance. Tolerance means I can think you're wrong, I can think you're doing something wrong, and I can still be absolutely accepting and tolerant. I don't have to agree with you, or you have to agree with me. As I was praying this, I was telling a cute little story that happened with me. At the very, very beginning of, almost, I don't know, must have been 18 years ago, 17 years ago. We had Shiva up in Bell Hill. So there was someone who was quite involved in Shabbos services and Minyan, etc. And then he introduced me to his family who wasn't that involved. And particular guy, his brother came along and I got to know him. And I ended up inviting his family for Shabbos. His girlfriend, I said, for sure, bring the girlfriend along, no problem. I'm sitting, this is before the Shabbos, a few days before Shabbos, I'm sitting in my office, and there's like this very nervous knock on my door. I turn around and it's this fellow. He's like very nervous. He says, Rabbi, can I talk to you? I said, sure, come in. And he's like very sheepish. He's like, I can see he was actually very nervous. He says to me, you know, you invited us for Shabbos, right? I said, sure, yeah, I'm expecting you, I'm looking forward. He says, my girlfriend too, right? I said, sure, I don't know what he wants from me. It took me a while, I clicked. He says to me very nervously, but she's not Jewish. I said, and? So what's the problem? Could you come too? So, and then a penny dropped, what his problem was, right? In other words, what was happening is like this, right? He in his mind, apparently I look quite religious, I'm told. So without asking me, he figured that intermarriage wasn't the value that I subscribed to, right? Which is correct. So he thought in his mind, therefore, that means that his girls wouldn't be welcome. And it just took me a second to actually figure that out. Now I'm sort of going to these kind of things, so I understand it better, but I don't quite understand what he wanted. I really didn't. And I turned around to him and I said, listen, let me be very honest with you. I said, if you came to have an appointment with me and you said, you didn't know me, you said, listen, I'm dating a non-Jew, do you think I should marry her? I'd have to be very honest with you and tell you, no, I don't think you should. That's what I'm doing. I'm not going to be dishonest with you. But I said, but you are, I mean, he was very involved with her already, but you know, you are obviously in a very serious relationship with her. You shouldn't be welcome in my house on Shabbos. What's one because with another? I really didn't understand it. I said, of course she's welcome. I'm sure she's a wonderful human being, but she is. And you're a wonderful guy. I'm not judging you to have the relationship. That's your business. If you ask my opinion, of course I will tell it to you. But I'm not going to condone it. But I'm more than welcome to my house on Shabbos. So you can. It happens to be that story has a very, very happy ending. She converted Orthodox, and they live a very, they moved away, but they actually live a very, very religiously involved life, very involved in the community, and it's a very beautiful story. But that wasn't the point of the story. The point was that what does one thing have to do with another? But I think it was just being part of society, and it's society that people get it's very hard for them to get their head around that you subscribe to a particular value, and you might strongly subscribe to that value, which means if you disagree with someone who doesn't subscribe to the value, which is true, but it's nothing to do with being accepting of them or non-judgmental of them or embracing them and engaging them. Am I making sense? Is this, yeah? Right? And that's what Tiferet is. It's not an easy thing. I mean, in that particular story for me it wasn't hard, but in other things where it is hard. But we each have our areas of life where that concept becomes very difficult, right? I mean, another example of this is, maybe this is a bit dangerous to say, but I'll say it anyway. Because I often get accused of this, right? I often get accused about, like, people say, would you, I mean, I'm an Orthodox rabbi, as you probably figured out by now. People often say to me, they talk about my relationship with non-Orthodox Judaism, with Reform Judaism, right? Would you invite a Reform rabbi to give a shiur of BINA, for example? And my answer is no, I wouldn't. And I'm often accused, well, that's very exclusionary and that's very non-accepting. And I have the same response. I said, it's nothing to be non-accepting. I believe in this particular philosophy. I've got nothing against the individual. I've had plenty of Reform people on my Shabbos table. I would have the Reform rabbi on my Shabbos table. And I'd go out with him for a drink. And I'd be very respectful of him. I could be very different with him. But we vehemently are on opposing views about what Yiddishkeit is about. And that's fine. Now, in Orthodox Judaism, there's a lot of diversity, there's a lot of room for diversity, and I'm trying to be respectful of everyone. But in terms of philosophy, it's a philosophy I cannot accept. Fundamental to Orthodox Judaism is that the Torah is divine and eternal and comes from Sinai. It is part of the DNA of what I believe in. That's what I'm doing here, right? That's my being, that's my definition, that's my identity. I cannot embrace a philosophy, not a person. I cannot embrace a philosophy that doesn't believe in it, and it's very clear. Look at their website; they don't believe in it, and that's their business, and I'm not judging them for it. And they have it, and they are free to do whatever they want, so to speak. But me not embracing that philosophy and not willing to incorporate or include that philosophy in what I do in life, that's not a contradiction to being accepting. That's not the definition of acceptance. I don't judge them, I accept them, I will be as accepting of them as people or as Jews as I would with everyone else, and yet I vehemently disagree with the philosophy, and that's fine. That's what society is, that's what it's about, right? So that's what Tiferet is, and that's a difficult thing sometimes, because society for some reason finds it very difficult to head around. I'll give you another example, completely different example, because this actually happened to me a couple of days ago, and I'm still struggling with it. Gossiping is a bad thing, right? We all agree? Right? Now, how about when you have to gossip? Not gossip, when you have to share something negative. Right? It's a killer thing, right? So, there are people that are very, very committed not to sharing negative information with other people, which is an unbelievable value. Right? If you go to the Talmud, and you look at the pages and pages of the Talmud that deal with Lashon Hara, not gossiping and evil speech, you will see the damage of evil speech, physically, spiritually. We can ruin people's lives. Gossiping does ruin people's lives, ruin people's reputation. It's a terrible, terrible thing. So it's a very beautiful value. If someone could live their life very hard, but someone could live their life not to gossip, it's a beautiful thing. Absolutely beautiful thing. Part of that value, of course, is kindness to others, not to be hurtful to others, and so on and so forth. And then, if someone has that nature and has that personality, that's beautiful. What a beautiful thing, right? I mean, not many people I know that will never gossip, but there are people like that just never say a bad word about anyone else, and that's the most beautiful thing. What happens when that person gets a call? My son's looking at dating that particular girl. What do you know about it? My friend is about to enter into a partnership business with so-and-so. What do you know about it? Right? What's the other example I gave you? Yeah. Employment or business deal, whatever the case is, right? So, and you happen to know beyond, not just you've heard, you happen to know first-hand knowledge. Now, this is a very complicated ethical dilemma, by the way, and it takes a whole another shira to go into it, exactly what this means, but you absolutely know that there's something wrong with this person. You know it beyond a shadow of doubt. Chafetz Chaim, the great master of ethics who dealt with these laws and these ethics, writes extensively about it. I'm not talking about interpretation, I'm not talking about hearsay. I'm talking about you absolutely know something that you know that person would want to know, and if they knew, they wouldn't enter in that business deal, they wouldn't enter in that relationship. You'll be hurting them by not sharing the information. Suddenly you need to speak up and you need to say evil speech. In fact, the Jewish law is that in such a situation, not only are you permitted to talk Lashon Hara, you have to talk Lashon Hara. What's interesting is everyone becomes all religious all of a sudden when it comes to this, right? You know, they'll sit after a wedding with their friend and they'll do like a post-mortem of the wedding and you know, what they were saying and what they were wearing and how they acted. No problem. But suddenly when it's a serious thing and their friend, oops, I don't want to get involved. You know, I don't get involved because I don't get involved. You know, I don't want to get involved. Okay. There's a personality of not getting involved, and for the most part, it's a very good personality. Why you want to get involved in politics and hatred? Sometimes you have to get involved. You have to have both of them. It's a very, very difficult thing. Same idea I said before. There, when you keep your extreme, when you keep the extreme, now, I'm a person who doesn't, on principle, I don't say evil things about other people. Why? Because I don't want to hurt anyone. And this time, by holding back information, you end up hurting a whole bunch of people. You end up hurting the person going into the deal. You end up hurting both people because they end up having a fallout, and it'll end badly, right? Because you didn't speak up. Very difficult thing. Yes.
What redress do you have if something like that didn't happen? Somebody should have said something like that.
There's nothing. It's between them and God. You can't do anything about it. You know, even if it's a business thing, you end up losing money from it, right? There's a principle in Jewish law called groma, which means when someone causes someone else's damage, but it's not quantifiable damage. It's not tangible. If I break your window, I'm going to pay for it, right? But if I say something to you and because of that I give you bad advice, you lost money, it's hard to, in a court of law, it's hard to, I imagine secular court too, it's very hard to get compensation for that. But it's a moral thing. I'll end with one interesting case because it's not necessarily relevant to everyone, but it brings out a beautiful point. And I'll tell you a story of one of the great sages called the Chazon Ish. Those in the room who are involved in education would know that one of the most excruciating dilemmas faced by people who run schools, for example, is sometimes when it might become necessary to expel a child from school. Right? Now, it happens, and it's a very, very difficult thing. Why is it a difficult thing? It's a difficult thing for two reasons. Right? Because, I know not all the education I said, but I'm just telling you because it brings out this point about being able to have two extremes at the same time. And to know if something's coming from your ego, from you, or it's coming because you're really looking for the truth. So, expelling a child from school, for example, is a very difficult thing because you can ruin the child's life. There's no question. Right? You can ruin the child's life. Child's felt in school, sometimes they feel rejected, they can go get involved in bad things, and so on and so forth, and many, many reasons why sometimes in particular communities the child doesn't have another school to go to that will fit the same lifestyle that their parents want, or values of the parents want, whatever the case is, that's a big problem. And therefore there are those educational leaders who sometimes will never expel a child under any circumstances, right? Which is also problematic because there's a concept, the Baba Rebbe talks about it when he was asked this question, there's a concept in Jewish law called Yachid v'Rabim. In other words, sometimes people say, well, I can't do it because I'm going to ruin this child. But the problem is that sometimes you have to do it because if you don't do it, you'll ruin every other child. Right? So it becomes a case, essentially, in those who write about it in sort of from a Jewish perspective, a Jewish law, it depends on what the issue is. If it's an issue just that the child has done something bad themselves, but essentially they're not really affecting the learning or the development of other children, then you need to give them consequences to educate them, but you must exclude them because they're not damaging everyone else. But if it's a case of a child actually doing something that will continuously damage the education of the others, it becomes Yachid v'Rabim. It's an individual versus many, and even though it's very harsh and very sad and very tragic, sometimes the many overrides the individual. Okay. So there's a beautiful story with the Chazon Ish. The Chazon Ish was a Lithuanian sage that lived in Bnei Brak before the war, I think, or just after the war. And he was very involved in giving advice to different schools. There was a whole bunch of different religious schools budding up then at the time in Israel. And this became an issue. There were, as every school, there were children with issues, etc. And he would always, on the one hand, he would tremendously emphasize that before you can expel a child from a school, you need to understand the severity of that. In other words, maybe it needs to happen sometimes, but you can't just do it flippantly, because understand the possible consequences. He used a halachic term called dinei nefashot, which means it's like a capital case. In other words, you might be ruining a child for life. Understand the severity, and it shouldn't be done individually. He held that it had to be done in consultation and collaboration with lots of educators, and so on and so on. Good, okay, that's fine. So one time there was a story where a principal came to the Chazon Ish and said the following. He said, Rabbi, I've done exactly that. I've collaborated, I've consulted, I've looked through it from all angles. I know the problem. I know the child, whatever the situation was, doesn't really have another school to go to. I don't have a choice. The school will close down if I keep him in the school. Right? It will be. Right? So Chazon Ish said to him the following. He said, if that's the case, I'm going to give you the go-ahead. Right? He came to the Chazon Ish with a final ruling. I'll give you the go-ahead on one condition. I want you to pull that child in and say to him like this. Say to him, I cannot keep you in the school any longer, because you are ruining the rest of the school. Warnings, we've tried, etc., etc. But I really care for you. And therefore, I'm going to expel you, but I'm going to give you an offer at the same time. I'm going to make a time every evening to learn with you, one-on-one. You come to my house, and we'll learn together. Right? The story goes, he did that, and the child actually grew up to be very, very functional, and was an amazing success at the end of the whole story. Right? It's such a simple thing, but such an amazing insight. In other words, the message that the child got, and this is where Tiferet is so important, that I understand you doing what you have to do, but you're not doing it because you hate me. You're not doing it because it's your personality and my personality that are clashing. You're not doing it because you have an agenda. You obviously are doing it because you really care for the school and for me. So you care for all the children. And your demonstration you're caring for me is that you're willing to make time to learn with me and to study with me, one-on-one. Right? In other words, the child was removed from the school with all its consequences, but yet never felt rejected. To do that, it requires an amazing degree of tiferet, because often when we get angry at our own children, or at our colleagues, or at our friends, or in a workplace where we have very, very strong disagreements, and sometimes those disagreements means that we have to take certain courses of action. But if we really do it because it's the truth, that's the question. Do we get emotionally involved? Are we angry? If we are angry, it never works. It's never effective. It's us. Same thing with children, same thing with friends, same with everything really, all relationships. Every relationship requires chesed and gvura. Every relationship sometimes requires, whatever, in different contexts, different ways, but it always requires a certain degree of firmness, and sometimes a great degree of firmness. But the question is, where's that gvura coming from? So if you don't, and where's the love coming from? Where's the chesed coming from? If it's coming from a perspective of truth, of selflessness, of doing what is right, then you can combine both extremes. Then what happens is, if it's coming from who I am, then one of two things will happen. Either I'll go to one extreme or the other. Either I won't be able to exercise the gevura, I won't be able to exercise the harshness, I won't be able to be firm, I won't be able to say no, I won't be able to expel the child, I won't be able to voice my opinion, and I will ruin the relationship. I'll undermine the very thing I'm working for. Or I will be able to do it. I'm a gvura person, I'll be very firm, as some people are, and be very tough, and fight to the end, but without any love, without any respect. And it'll be like disrespectful conflict and dialogue that we find in Parliament, and we find in society today in general, where people just can't do one or the other. They're either non-confrontational, or they're confrontational to the degree of being so disrespectful and so rude and so non-accepting that it's just a dysfunctional relationship situation. But if it's coming from the middle, if it's coming from the ability to look at what is needed, what's going to build this relationship, what is going to actually achieve the ultimate goal of the relationship, which is connection, which is love, which is care, which is real acceptance, which is real respect, then I will find the way within me to incorporate the balance. Not just a bit of both, but even if it requires extreme of both, where I can exercise extreme acceptance, extreme love, extreme respect, and at the same time I can find within me to be extremely fair and firm and strict and harsh even, if I need to and when I need to, but in the right context. It's that combination of tiferet that leads to ultimate effective living, because that's moral living and true living, and looking for what's true rather than what my bias and my agenda is. It's a difficult path. It's a difficult work. It takes extreme personal growth. But that's really what we always have to try and do. To have a look, what is not about me, what is needed, what is the right thing to do. And when it's the right thing to do, then I can bring those two opposites together and lead to a much, much better outcome. Next week, we can have a look at a different aspect of this whole idea, but along the same thing. Have a great week.